know who read a lot of contemporary romance novels, got burnt out, and has barely been reading the past week? This guy. So this isn't the video that was supposed to be up today. Like, not at all. So I need a video to go up today. Obviously the vlog I was working on isn't going up today. So what we're gonna do today is I want to talk about books by Black authors that I've read over the past few years that I really, really like. And in exchange, I would like for you guys to recommend books by Black authors that I should read, that I should add to my TBR, or if they're already on my TBR, that I should prioritize. These books are in really no particular order. They're just books that I like, that I can think of off the top of my head, that are written by Black authors. So I want to start with a book that I read the longest ago. And it's something that I read in college for a feminist literature class, and it's called Passing by Nella Larson. Now, this, I want to say it was written in the 60s, but I could be really off on it, but it is about a light-skinned Black woman who can pass as a white woman. And there's a lot of stories like this. But this particular one is the one that has stuck in my head the longest, and I kind of want to like do a vlog where I'm reading a bunch of books about passing. Would you guys be interested in seeing something like that? Anyway, I read this back in like 2014, and I still, like, it's still stuck in my head today, which says something about the book, considering how many books I read every year. I very much enjoy this. I very much want to like revisit this from a lens of enjoyment instead of classwork. But if you were interested in reading those kind of stories, which again, like I said, is kind of popular recently. I've read or heard of quite a few books with that premise that have come out in like the last 2 or 3 years. But I do recommend going like old school with this and picking up Passing. From there, let's go with a couple of books that I have read extremely recently. I have only given 2 books 5 stars this year, and both of them are by Black authors. Make of that what you will. First off was Coming of Age in Mississippi by Anne Moody, and this is just a autobiography of this woman's childhood from like the 1940s when she was born. I think it starts when she was 5 years old, until the 1960s in the civil rights movement, which she heavily participates in, basically until she graduates college. And it's told in such a wonderful, easy to read conversational tone, and it's just interesting to read about somebody involved in the civil rights movement that isn't one of like the important men of the civil rights movement, because you know women participated in civil rights, but you don't really read a whole lot about them. Like, you have Rosa Parks, but outside of her, name 5 women who participated in civil rights movements, right? So having that story from her own perspective and not an outside perspective, and the fact that she's not a leader of the civil rights movement, just an everyday person participating, it's really, really interesting. So if you want to learn more about racism in the 40s and 50s, as well as what the civil rights look like from just a Jane Doe's perspective, then I do recommend this autobiography. The other book that I gave 5 stars this year is Me, or Me parentheses Moth, by Amber McBride, and this is a novel in verse, this is the second novel in verse I've ever read. The first one I read was Clap When You Land, and I listened to that as audiobook, but this one I like actually read, and it reads just like a regular novel. Like, your eyes don't move like a regular novel, but the story comes through. And it was weird and haunting. It was just the right kind of weird for me. It's like a very close circle. You have one character and she is basically telling the story and she's having like a conversation with one other character. And so you really only have the communication between the two of them. You don't have like a whole lot of outside influence outside their little world. She's not really an unlikable character very much. She doesn't like herself, but she's not traditionally unlikable. And that small enclosed setting where we as the reader don't have like a larger world view of what's going on in the background of the story, and the fact that it's like weird and a little bit ghosty, just my kind of book. So I highly recommend this, especially if you've never tried a novel in verse, because it's like, oh god, I don't want to read poetry, but they're actually pretty cool. So I recommend that if you haven't picked it up. It's poetry, so it doesn't take very long to read at all, and your library might have it. So highly recommend. From there, let's talk about Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. The sequel to that just came out. So Black Leopard, Red Wolf is grimdark fantasy, but set in a fantasy setting, obviously, that is reminiscent of Africa instead of like the typical medieval European settings. So that's already cool, but I do have to warn you that it is 100% grim dark. There are very graphic visual sexual assault scenes. There are like heavily descriptions of bodily functions that you may or may not want to read about. But look at trigger warnings and understand that it's grimdark before you go into it. But if you like grimdark fantasy and you can handle those trigger warnings, I do highly recommend this series. At least the first book in the series. I haven't read the second book yet, but highly recommend first book in the series, and it's really good as an audiobook. So if you do audiobooks, or do like read a physical book while you're doing an audiobook, I highly recommend consuming it this way. But if you like grimdark fantasy and want something outside of the realm of just a medieval European setting, Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James is where I say you go. From there, let's talk about another fantasy, and that's Sorryland by Rivers Solomon. This one is like sci-fi fantasy, I would say. It's weird. This one, not for everybody. You have to actively like just weird books for this one. But this is told in such an interesting way, and it's so weird but so good at the same time. I actually recommend pretty much anything that catches your interest by Rivers Solomon. I've read 3 books by them. 2 of them I absolutely loved, and one of them I was like, okay. But fantastic writer of weird sci-fi and fantasy, and if you just need like a weird kick, go with Rivers Solomon. Also, if you like to read about trans or gender fluid characters, Rivers Solomon is also a great choice. Since we're talking about fantasy, let's move into another fantasy book, and that is The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna. This is young adult fantasy that also has a very violent, graphic beginning. But once you get past the violence in the beginning, you get a very strong female character who becomes like a warrior, and you kind of follow her through this school where she is learning to defeat or fight these like demonic creatures that are attacking the land. This one, not like my absolute favorite fantasy. I have been struggling more and more with young adult fantasy as I get older, but I do think this is a really good book if you like young adult fantasy. And one of the better young adult fantasies that I have read in the past few years. So highly recommend. I don't know where this story goes further in the series, because a lot of series, especially young adult series, like the first book is really good, and then in the second book, like the characters are completely different people and you're like, what the hell happened? So I don't know about going further in the series. I don't know that the second book's even come out yet, but the first book, fantastic. And after that, let's talk about a sci-fi, since we're kind of in that realm anyway. But let's talk about Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor. Now, for me at least, Nnedi Okorafor is a hit or miss author. Some of the books by her I really like, and some of them I'm like, I'm dragging through this and it's taking me forever to read it. But the premise is always awesome in her books. Like, her creativity is insane. So she writes in like a sci-fi Nigeria, very scientifically advanced, but also with like a general population of backwards people, where Christianity and like religious superstition are often placed above scientific advancements. But she also has like conversations about like global warming and the evil of giant corporations. This one is about like a really, really young girl who's poisonous, and it's just kind of like, what is going on? I really enjoyed this story, and it's really short. So if you want to read something by Nnedi Okorafor, or you want to dip your toes into African sci-fi, I recommend this one because it gives you a feel for Nnedi Okorafor's writing and introduces you to maybe a new setting if all you really read is like American settings for your sci-fi or like space settings for your sci-fi. So from there, let's move into like genres I don't typically read, which is basically anything that's not fantasy or sci-fi. And there are a lot of Black authors that I really, really love in genres that I don't always, or in genres that I don't typically read. One of them is like horror thriller. Now, I'm very, very hit or miss on horrors and thrillers. I like things that scare me, and I have a hard time being scared or creeped out or like get anxiety from books. It's much easier to creep me out in like a visual setting. But I read When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole, I think last year, and that had so much anxiety. Like, I can't imagine being terrified for my life and no one cares if I die or not. She has no ability to call the police because they're racist trash. Everybody around her is like, yeah, you're just imagining things. Nothing's happening. You're crazy. Ableism aside with that thought, it's just like, it made me so anxious to imagine myself in that situation, and then to know that people really in 2022 go through situations like that where they have no help from the people who are supposed to be helping. They have no help from the people who are supposed to be helping them, which, terrifying. The end of that book gets a little like silly, but I think that worked for me. And understand that this is a thriller, not a horror. It is a thriller, but it's not one of those like fast-paced thrillers. It is a slow-paced thriller. So not everybody likes it, but I like it. And if you're reading only thrillers by white authors, hey, maybe pick this up. I think everything I have left is either like nonfiction or contemporary. So let's just go through and whatever order I've written them down. First is Stamped by Jason Reynolds, which is a remix, a historical remix based on Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. So Stamped from the Beginning is a very thick historical novel, or is a very thick historical account by Ibram X. Kendi, and then Jason Reynolds took it and rewrote all of that information for teenagers. Is a way for teenagers to learn about Black history, because it's not really taught in schools very well. So this was one of the most easily read conversational nonfictions that I have come across. I have never read Stamped from the Beginning. I have it, I just haven't gotten around to reading it because it is thick, but Stamped is very good, very interesting, well written for a teenage audience, I think. It's also like not so young and juvenile that adults can't read it. Maybe you're interested in learning more about Black history, but you don't like, you know, learning school textbook, academic works. That's the word I'm looking for. You don't really like reading like an academic level type work. This might be good for you as an introduction to just more about Black history. It was fantastically written, easily conversational, easily consumed, and I actually learned a lot of things that I didn't know existed in history, because the history that they teach at least the public schools I went to are very whitewashed. So highly recommend if you're looking for like more of an educational book. Another book, this is fiction, but it's fiction that could easily be just an autobiography, and that's The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This is like a modern set. I mean, obviously I just said it's contemporary. This is about a girl who is in a car with a Black guy friend, and he is shot and killed by the police, and he didn't do anything wrong. He's just driving while Black, and you're from her perspective, and her perspective is very interesting because she is a Black girl who spends a lot of time exclusively with white people. She goes to an almost all-white public school, and you see that the idea of Black people behaving more white and they will be accepted is just a racist myth, because she's always going to be considered, or she's always going to be othered and considered Black no matter how white she tries to behave. And this is her kind of like warring with herself over what type of person she wants to be. Does she continue trying to impress white people, trying to benefit herself by acting more white, or does she embrace her Blackness regardless of what racist white people think of being Black as an othering type of situation? This is really sad, so go into it knowing that. And it's not really the type of book that I normally would pick up, just because I don't really read any young adult contemporary, but I picked it up for something. Maybe I got it in a book box, and it turned out really, really good. So even if it doesn't necessarily sound like something you normally read, I'd still recommend picking it up, and kind of extending your worldview. Next up, I want to talk about Difficult Women by Roxane Gay, which is a short story collection. So this one's kind of like all over the place. There are some fantasy, there are some contemporary. Something about Roxane Gay's writing makes me want to write. I don't know what it is. I'm not a writer. I really have no like desire to write my own book or short story collection or anything like that. I just enjoy consuming other people's writing, but reading Roxane Gay, at least this short story collection, makes me want to write. I don't know what it is. So take that however you will, and pick up this short story collection and read it, because it is fantastic. And the last book I want to talk about, this one, I don't know that I would really recommend it to the masses. I think that this one was something that meant more to me than it necessarily would to anybody else. But if you're interested in learning more about the event called the Great Migration, where a lot of Black people after Reconstruction or during Reconstruction are just fleeing from southern states in a way from like lynchings and violent racism like that, and going elsewhere, whether it's New Jersey, Chicago, or California, or other places, and just trying to survive. This is an interesting tale because this is Morgan Jerkins' family history. So she traces her family through the Great Migration. And she has like different chapters and stuff like that where she looks at like Creole cultures, Gullah Geechee cultures, like Native American, so like Cherokee specifically, and how they treat tribal people who are part Cherokee and part Black, which is not well. And then even kind of like looks at California. And for me, a lot of the places that she talks about are places I've lived before. So it was very interesting to me. And I had really never heard of the Great Migration before reading this book, which says a lot about public school education because this was a huge event and no one really talks about it. So this is more of like a specialty. Like if you're looking more at Black history and you want a book specifically about one section of Black history, this is one of those books. I would like more books like this recommended. So if you know anything that's really good, let me know down in the comments below. Before I close out this video, I don't have any other books, but I do want to talk about a audiobook narrator. Her name is Bonnie Turpin. Bahni, which I think is pronounced Bonnie. And she is like, she's an actress. She is a huge audiobook narrator. Like if you look her up, she's got like 300 plus books that she has narrated. And she, I think, is by far one of my absolute favorite audiobook narrators. So if you want to pick up an audiobook, you're not really sure, kind of look at the audiobooks that she's narrated and then pick one of those, because you're going to have a wonderful, wonderful experience with that book. I am currently reading a book right now, audiobook that is narrated by her. So highly, 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 highly recommend her as an audiobook narrator. Anyway, that's today's video. Again, leave me recommendations about books I should read by Black authors down in the comments below, and hopefully I'll have a vlog for you Tuesday. If I don't finish the books, I think I'll put up my TBR on Tuesday. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Anyway, see you in the next video. Bye.